Chapter 1. The Mythical Prologue. More than 4 millennia ago, when time was still counted by suns and moons, the vast territory we now call China was inhabited by scattered tribes. There was no nation, no common language, no power that rose above the chaos of rival clans. The valley of the Yellow River, fertile cradle of primitive cultures, boiled with struggles over water, land, and mere survival. In that rugged landscape emerged a figure destined to mark a before and after: Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor. Tradition places him around 2700 BC, a date already blending the mythical with the historical. Some saw him as a solar deity, others as a warrior chieftain, still others as the first great legislator. But what fascinates is not who he truly was, but what he represented: the birth of order. Where tribal dispersion reigned, Huangdi rose as a symbol of unity, as the architect of an identity that would endure through the centuries. Legend says that Huangdi was born under celestial omens. His mother, Fu Bao, witnessed a great light in the sky while walking on Mount Shou. That light spiraled downward, and soon after she conceived. The child who was born was called Xuanyuan, but later became known as Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, associated with the element of earth and the center of the universe, according to Chinese cosmology. From childhood, young Xuanyuan displayed superior intelligence. Stories tell of his ability to understand the language of animals and read the signs of the stars. It was said that his gaze could inspire obedience, and that his voice conveyed calm even in the midst of storms. These supernatural gifts made him the natural leader of his clan, the Yuxiong. One of the most famous episodes that cemented his legend was the war against Qi Yu, a fearsome chieftain described as a monster of metal and blood. Chronicles depict him with a bronze head, bull horns, and unbeatable strength. He was the leader of the Zhuli tribe and sowed chaos in the region, defying all neighboring clans. The battle between Huangdi and Qi Yu at Zhuolu is told as an almost cosmic confrontation. It is said that Qi Yu unleashed a thick fog to confuse Huangdi's army. But the Yellow Emperor, shrewd and inventive, devised a rudimentary compass to guide his men through the darkness. This detail is no minor point. Tradition credits Huangdi with the invention of orientation instruments, one of the pillars of Chinese science. After long days of struggle, Huangdi managed to defeat Qi Yu, but the victory was not only military, it was symbolic. By defeating the monster chieftain, he established the supremacy of his clan and consolidated the idea that under his rule, there could exist an order greater than brute force. It was the beginning of an authority that transcended tribal power to become a civilizational principle. Huangdi is not remembered only as a warrior. Tradition attributes to him a legacy of inventions and discoveries that seem to condense into a single figure the advances of entire generations. It is said that he and his ministers introduced primitive writing, organized agriculture, animal domestication, the use of herbal medicine, and ritual music. One of the most curious stories involves his wife Leizu, to whom the invention of silk is attributed. According to myth, while she was drinking tea beneath a mulberry tree, a silkworm cocoon fell into her cup. When she tried to remove it, she noticed it could be unraveled into a fine, resistant thread. Fascinated, she began to weave, and thus emerged one of the most important treasures in Chinese history: silk, which centuries later would open the way for the Silk Road. Another fascinating aspect is his role in the development of traditional medicine. The Huangdi Neijing, or Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor, is one of the oldest medical texts in humanity. Though his direct authorship is unlikely, it is attributed to him as a symbol of knowledge linking body, nature, and cosmos. The text describes the theory of yin and yang, the meridians of energy, and practices that remain the foundation of Chinese medicine to this day. Imagine for a moment Huangdi not only as a chieftain, but as a sage surrounded by counselors, debating vital energy, how the seasons influence health, and how man should live in harmony with heaven and earth. This portrait distances him from a mere conqueror and transforms him into an architect of Chinese thought. Stories also speak of his fascination with immortality. Huangdi is said to have journeyed in search of the islands of the immortals, mythical places in the Eastern Sea where sages guarded the secret of eternal life. It is said that he finally ascended to the heavens on a yellow dragon, surrounded by a celestial cortege. For the Chinese imagination, he did not die as a common man, he transcended as a divinity. What is most interesting is how his figure transformed over time. In texts from the Han Dynasty, Huangdi already appears as the common ancestor of all Chinese, unifying them in a shared genealogy. In fact, even today, Chinese culture uses the expression descendants of Yan and Huang to refer to the people as offspring of these mythical emperors. His myth served not only as an origin story, but also as a political instrument. In different eras, rulers invoked Huangdi as a symbol of legitimacy and continuity. Each dynasty found in him a root that reinforced its right to rule. Chapter 2. Battles and Tribal Alliances. The world of Huangdi was not a consolidated empire, nor even an orderly confederation. It was a mosaic of clans, each with its chiefs, its totems, its rites, and its gods. The lands north of the Yellow River were inhabited by tribes competing with one another like hungry wolves, and in that setting, alliances were as fragile as leaves in the wind. It was in the midst of this chaos that Huangdi demonstrated one of his greatest abilities, the capacity to unite without erasing, to subdue without destroying. The chronicles say that Huangdi understood that military power alone could not guarantee stability. That is why he began to practice a new art for those times, tribal diplomacy. He summoned rival leaders not only to war, but also to banquets, to blood pacts, to ceremonies where the ancestors themselves were witnesses. Instead of annihilating the defeated, he integrated them. This vision proved revolutionary. Clans ceased to be temporary enemies and became pieces of a greater structure. One curious story tells that on one occasion, Huangdi invited a rival chief to share a ritual sacrifice. Both slaughtered a black bull under the open sky, and with the blood they marked their faces. The gesture symbolized not only the end of hostilities but the creation of a spiritual bond. Witnesses swore that this pact was stronger than any treaty of arms. One of the most remembered episodes was his confrontation with Yan, another of the great mythical chieftains. Yan was Lord of Fire and ruled over a vast fertile territory. For years his clans disputed the borders with the people of Huangdi. The decisive battle took place at Bangquan. It was a long and bloody confrontation that lasted through 3 successive encounters. Huangdi, with cunning, organized his troops into disciplined formations, something uncommon in tribal wars. Finally, Yan was defeated, but not destroyed. And here lay the political genius of Huangdi. Instead of eliminating his rival, he integrated him into a structure of power. From that alliance would arise the myth that the Chinese are descendants of Yan and Huang, uniting 2 lineages that, had they remained separate, would never have founded a common identity. But the true trial by fire came with Qi Yu, the leader of the Zhuli tribe. He was described as a supernatural warrior, with the body of a man and the head of a beast, armed with bronze swords and accompanied by 72 equally fierce brothers. His troops were numerous, and it is said they knew arts of war unknown to the other clans. The Battle of Zhuolu was engraved in collective memory as the confrontation between barbarism and civilization. Qi Yu used magical mists to confuse his enemies, a detail that may allude to tactics of war using smoke or fire. Huangdi, ingenious, is said to have created the first directional compass, made of lodestone, to guide his troops in the confusion. This account, legendary or not, reinforces the idea of Huangdi not only as a warrior, but also as an inventor who used ingenuity to overcome brute force. In the end, Qi Yu was captured and executed, but his image never disappeared. Peasants remembered him as a protective spirit of war and metallurgy. In some villages, sacrifices were even offered to him, showing the ambiguity of the myth. The defeated enemy became a revered figure. Beyond the legends, what matters is how these stories reflect the transition from a tribal society to a more organized one. Huangdi did not merely win battles. He knew how to institutionalize victory. Each defeated tribe was reorganized under a system of subordinate chieftains. Hierarchies were established along with obligations of tribute and participation in common ceremonies. A little-known detail is that Huangdi is credited with creating military banners to identify each group on the battlefield. This not only had practical value but also symbolic. The tribes, upon seeing their flags alongside that of the Yellow Emperor, felt part of a greater entity. It was the seed of a state. The wars of Huangdi should not be understood only as military conflicts. They were stories that founded legitimacy. Each victory was narrated as a cosmic act. Defeating Yan meant mastering fire, defeating Qi Yu represented overcoming barbarism. These symbols were more powerful than swords, for they gave meaning to obedience. In this sense, Huangdi was one of the first to understand that power needs myths. The strength of arms is not enough. It is necessary to build a story that endures. And thus, the battles of Bangquan and Zhuolu became central chapters of a national narrative that still resonates in Chinese memory. What is most surprising is that these battles, despite their mythical nature, still carry cultural weight. In the 20th century, archaeologists and politicians evoked Huangdi and Qiyu to reinforce national identities. While in the north, Huangdi was exalted as the father of Chinese civilization. In the south, some groups began to claim Qiyu as an ethnic hero of resistance. Thus, the same ancestral story nourished different discourses, demonstrating the symbolic power of those tales. After his victories, Huangdi consolidated his rule not only with the sword, but with rites. The sources tell that he instituted sacrifices on Mount Tai, where he offered animals to the gods of heaven and earth. There, defeated clan chiefs had to appear and pay tribute, turning the ritual into a political act. In fact, some historians suggest that this custom was the precedent of the idea of the mandate of heaven, the notion that the ruler exercises power not only by force, but because the gods approve. Although this doctrine would be formalized centuries later, it can already be glimpsed in the practices attributed to Huangdi. With each alliance, Huangdi was building something greater than an empire. He was building a narrative of belonging. His figure became the nucleus of a system where politics, the military, and religion were united. People began to recognize themselves as descendants of the same ancestor, as members of the same civilization. That was his true triumph, turning tribal chaos into a shared identity. And that identity, beyond military victories or defeats, became the seed of what we today understand as China. Chapter 3: The Inventor, Emperor, and the Birth of Culture. The legacy of Huangdi is not measured only in military victories. Where other chieftains would have been remembered merely as war leaders, his name transcended because tradition turned him into the architect of civilization. Under his mythical reign, humanity ceased to live solely by instinct and began to create tools, symbols, and knowledge that ordered the life of the clans. His figure absorbed into collective memory all the inventions that marked a turning point in history, to the extent that the Yellow Emperor was no longer just a ruler, but the very embodiment of culture itself. It is said that it was during his reign that writing emerged. The ancients affirm that his chronicler Kangji observed the footprints of animals in the sand and the twisted branches of trees to invent the first characters. Legend says that when writing was born, the spirits wept and the demons fled. Humanity had just fixed the world into symbols. From that moment, words would no longer be lost in the wind. They could be preserved and transmitted. Culture also found form in music. Huangdi understood that sounds could reflect universal order, and he ordered the construction of bells, drums, and flutes. Music accompanied ceremonies, sacrifices, and war councils, and it was regarded as a mirror of government. There is a tale that during a banquet, upon hearing a dissonant melody, the emperor stopped everything and rebuked the musicians. If the music was chaotic, so too would be the people. In this logic, ruling was maintaining harmony between notes, bodies, and stars. One of the most famous episodes of Huangdi's reign involves his wife Leizu and the discovery of silk. It is said that while drinking tea under a mulberry tree, a cocoon fell into her cup. As she tried to remove it, she discovered that the filament unraveled into an endless thread, bright and resistant. Intrigued, Leizu experimented until she transformed it into fabric. Thus was born the art of silk, a secret zealously guarded for centuries, which would later connect China with the world through the Silk Road. Medicine was also associated with his figure. The texts attributed to his name, such as the Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor, describe the theory of yin and yang, the cycles of nature, and the vital energy of the body. It is difficult to know how much historical reality lies in these teachings, but the myth says that Huangdi himself debated with his counselors on how the seasons influenced health, or how foods could balance or disrupt the organism. One anecdote suggests that in times of famine, he ordered his people to test unknown herbs in search of remedies. Many died poisoned, but from that sacrifice came the first medicinal records. Time, which until then had been perceived vaguely, began to be measured under his reign. It is said that Huangdi spent entire nights observing the stars and marking lines in the sand to establish a rudimentary calendar. By controlling time, man could foresee planting and harvest, organize sacrifices, and regulate the seasons of work. Even in the military field, Huangdi became a symbol of innovation. He is credited with light war chariots, stronger bronze spears, and according to tradition, a rudimentary compass of lodestone that allowed him to orient himself in the fog during the battle against Qiyu. There is also mention of laws, of social norms, and of a principle of justice. One story tells that a man was caught stealing grain from the communal storehouse. Instead of executing him, Huangdi condemned him to work twice as much in the fields, handing over his entire harvest to the community. This gesture, passed down as an example, reflected a form of justice that sought discipline and correction more than mere punishment. All of this, the writing, the music, the silk, the medicine, the calendar, the weapons, and the laws, were surely the achievements of entire generations, but collective memory condensed them into a single man. Huangdi was transformed into the vessel of all the inventions and knowledge that defined the passage from clans to civilization. Chapter 4. The Emperor and the Mysteries of Immortality. The Yellow Emperor was not only remembered as an inventor and legislator. In Chinese memory, he also appears as a man obsessed with the mysteries of life and death, a ruler who was not content with dominating the earth, but sought to converse with the heavens. To grasp the greatness of his myth, one must see him not only as a warrior king, but as a spiritual traveler who longed to reach eternity. Stories tell that Huangdi spent long nights in the mountains, meditating and observing the sky. There he sought to decipher the invisible forces that moved the universe. It was said that the emperor could summon the immortal sages who taught him secrets that ordinary men could never know. One such legend speaks of his encounter with Guangchengzi, a hermit who lived high atop Mount Kongtong. This elder, described as a luminous and almost divine being, revealed to him the arts of the Tao, the harmony with the cosmos, and the paths to preserve vital energy. Huangdi listened for days, and according to the texts, abandoned war for a time to focus on perfecting his spirit. No less fascinating is the tradition that links him to primitive alchemy. The emperor is said to have gathered his counselors in search of the substance of immortality, experimenting with herbs, metals, and elixirs. From these stories arises the idea that Chinese alchemy, long before it became a popular practice, was born under the shadow of Huangdi. Some tales say he drank potions made of ground jade, believing that this eternal and pure mineral could transfer its durability to the human body. Others recount that he sent men to distant lands to gather rare plants in the hope of discovering the secret to endless life. Huangdi's spirituality is also reflected in his relationship with ancestral spirits. Tradition tells that he performed rituals in which the dead were honored as invisible guardians of the people. These rites not only maintained social cohesion, but also reinforced his legitimacy. By being the mediator between the living and the ancestors, the emperor placed himself at the center of a cosmic order that united him to both earth and heaven. One of the most enigmatic episodes tells how Huangdi ascended to the heavens at the end of his life. Instead of dying as a common man, he is said to have mounted a winged dragon that carried him to the celestial realm. The scene was passed down for centuries as a symbol of his superhuman nature. He was not defeated by time nor by death, but merged with the gods. For the ancients, his disappearance was not a loss, but the confirmation that he had attained what he had sought his entire life: immortality. Though impossible to verify, these stories reveal something essential about the mentality of the time. The Yellow Emperor was not merely a political founder, but also a spiritual guide. In him was concentrated the human dream of overcoming the passage of time, of finding a cosmic meaning to life. His image marked not only the origins of Chinese culture, but also the eternal aspiration to transcend the limits of humanity. Thus, the myth of Huangdi is double: father of civilization and seeker of eternity. And in that union of science, magic, and faith, one of the most powerful figures of the entire Chinese tradition was forged. A hero who taught not only how to sow the land or forge weapons, but also how to lift one's gaze to the stars in search of answers greater than life itself. Chapter 5. The Gifts of the Yellow Emperor. The Yellow Emperor, unlike any ordinary ruler, did not fade away in silence, nor was he devoured by the oblivion of time. His end, according to ancient chronicles, was as grand as his life: an ascent into the heavens riding a dragon, surrounded by immortal sages and protective spirits. But if one looks beyond the myth, what truly remains is the way Huangdi became the eternal root of a collective identity. China adopted him as a father, not because everyone believed in his miracles, but because everyone needed a shared origin. What is fascinating is that his legacy was not confined to the ancients. For millennia, each generation found in Huangdi a reflection of what it most needed. For some, he was an invincible warrior. For others, a brilliant inventor. For philosophers, a seeker of truth. Even in recent times, when the nation endured wars, invasions, and revolutions, his name resurfaced as a symbol of resistance. This was no coincidence. In times of chaos, recalling the first unifier served to reinforce the idea that, despite all divisions, the Chinese shared a common root. A striking example occurred during the Han Dynasty. At that time, emperors sought to consolidate their power over a vast, newly unified territory. And what better strategy than to proclaim themselves descendants of Huangdi? By declaring themselves heirs of the Yellow Emperor, they presented themselves not only as temporary rulers, but as the legitimate guardians of the mandate of heaven. This detail is crucial. The myth of Huangdi was not a mere embellishment, but a real political instrument used to govern millions of people. In the mountains of Shanxi lies a mausoleum, traditionally attributed to Huangdi. It is unknown whether he truly rests there, but for centuries, peasants, nobles, and officials traveled to the site to pay homage. It is said that at certain times pilgrims would climb the hill carrying cypress branches, which they then planted around the symbolic tomb. Over time, the mountain became covered with a forest, still seen today as a living testimony to the devotion to a common ancestor. The image is powerful. Each tree is an extended root of a gigantic family, the entire nation recognizing itself as the descendant of one origin. And it was not an isolated cult. During the Tang dynasty, for example, emperors organized lavish ceremonies in honor of Huangdi, with sacrifices, music, and recitations of ancient hymns. They did so not only out of respect, but because the memory of the Yellow Emperor served to unify a cosmopolitan empire that stretched from Arab merchants to Indian Buddhist monks. Invoking Huangdi, in that context, was a way to remind everyone that, regardless of diversity, there was a single point of departure. In modern China, his figure also reappears. In 1942, during the war against the Japanese invasion, a group of nationalist leaders organized a ceremony at Huangdi's mausoleum. The intent was clear: to demonstrate that, despite the pain and the foreign threat, China had not lost its soul. Decades later, in the People's Republic, those ceremonies were revived, adapted to a more secular language, yet with the same purpose, reinforcing historical continuity. Even today, the Qingming festival, when ancestors are honored, often includes references to the Yellow Emperor as the ancestor of all. But what is most interesting is how the myth remains flexible, capable of transforming according to the needs of each era. For a Song dynasty peasant, Huangdi could be the sage who taught farming and healing. For a Han dynasty soldier, he was the warrior who defeated Qi Yu with cunning and new weapons. For a Ming dynasty physician, he was the interlocutor of the inner canon, an emperor who debated with his advisors about the secrets of vital energy. And for a 20th century politician, he was the banner of national unity against foreign powers. That ability to become what people needed explains why his memory never disappeared. There are lesser-known stories that add an almost human dimension. One recounts that on one occasion, Huangdi disguised himself as a villager and walked among his people to hear their complaints and hopes firsthand. He discovered that many suffered under heavy taxes and endless wars. Upon returning to the palace, he summoned his ministers and demanded reforms. The veracity of this tale is impossible to confirm, but its very existence reveals how tradition sought to portray him not only as a distant ruler, but as someone close, concerned for the humblest. Another curious episode tells of how Huangdi promoted the use of bronze mirrors, not only as ornaments, but as ritual tools. It was said that these mirrors could reflect not the face, but the soul of whoever looked into them. In temples dedicated to his memory, some priests used mirrors to judge the purity of officials. If the reflection appeared cloudy, it was interpreted as a sign of moral corruption. This detail, though it sounds fantastical, shows how the myth of the Yellow Emperor intertwined with social values such as justice and honesty. The end of Huangdi also has multiple versions. One claims that, after decades of rule, he summoned his people to announce that he had attained full understanding of the Tao, the universal way. After a final speech, a yellow dragon descended from the clouds and carried him into the heavens. Another version suggests that he mysteriously disappeared into a cave, and his body was never found because he transformed into pure energy. What matters is not which version is true, but the idea they convey. Huangdi did not die, he became something eternal. And in doing so, he left open the possibility that one day he might return to guide his people in times of crisis. The impact of these legends on the collective consciousness is immense. Consider what it means to have a common ancestor who, instead of dying, ascends to the heavens. It is not just a religious myth, but a powerful cultural metaphor. As long as Huangdi remains alive in memory, the civilization he founded also remains alive. If one looks closely, the true legacy of the Yellow Emperor is not the inventions tradition attributes to him nor the battles he won, but the very idea of continuity. In a world where kingdoms constantly rose and fell, China needed a fixed point, a symbol that would outlast change. Huangdi fulfilled that role. He was the anchor that kept a people united across the centuries, the immortal face of a civilization in motion. That is why, whenever his name is mentioned, it is not just about a king of the past, but about a promise. The promise that, no matter the trials, wars, or divisions, there will always be an origin to return to. And that promise, repeated for more than 4 millennia, is the reason why the Yellow Emperor does not belong only to China's mythical past, but also to its present and, without doubt, to its future. Chapter 6. The Roar of Qi Yu. Among the legends surrounding the Yellow Emperor, none is as vibrant and dangerous as that of Qi Yu, the ancestral enemy who embodied chaos, brutality, and the indomitable force of war. Qi Yu was not a simple rival. He was a titan with 100 arms, with the head of a bull and the voice of thunder. It is said that his breath could turn into thick fog and that his footsteps made the earth tremble. For many, he represented primitive violence, that wild energy that precedes order, and it was precisely against him that Huangdi had to face in order to prove that he was destined to reign over all. The story tells that Qi Yu ruled over 72 tribes, a fierce army that devastated villages and subdued entire populations. No one seemed capable of stopping him because he not only used brute force, he was cunning, cruel, and knew secrets of sorcery that confused his enemies. One of his most feared weapons was the magical fog with which he darkened the battlefields, blinding rival warriors until they fell into confusion. There, in the midst of that chaos, Qi Yu's men ravaged mercilessly. When the news of these invasions reached Huangdi, there was no doubt that he had to act. It was not only about defending his people, but about proving that he could impose order in the face of anarchy. The most prudent advisors warned him of the danger. Some even doubted that a man, no matter how wise he was, could defeat such a monster. But Huangdi replied that it was not enough to be strong. It was necessary to be intelligent. And with that conviction, he began to prepare for the most famous battle in all of Chinese mythology. The chosen field was Zhuolu, a place where monuments still rise today that remember that struggle. Huangdi did not bring only weapons but also inventions. It is said that before the battle he created the primitive compass, a wooden chariot that always pointed south, and with it he was able to guide his soldiers through Qi Yu's fog. Where others got lost, he advanced with precision. It was the first time that science confronted magic, and the result surprised everyone. The clash was brutal. Qi Yu and his hosts charged with roars that seemed to tear the sky apart. But Huangdi's troops resisted. For entire days the combat raged with fury, as if the very earth were at stake. In the midst of the din, it is said that Huangdi invoked the goddess of heaven, who sent a torrential rain to extinguish the fires caused by Qi Yu. But the titan did not surrender. He once again covered everything with his impenetrable fog. Then Huangdi deployed his invention, the pointing chariot, which allowed his army to orient themselves and advance until breaking the enemy ranks. The defeat of Qi Yu was not simple. According to some versions, he was captured, chained, and beheaded, and his head was displayed as a warning. In others, his body was buried in multiple places because even dead, his spirit continued terrifying men. In certain regions of China, he is still venerated as the god of war, feared and respected, as if the shadow of his fury had never completely disappeared. The essential thing is that this victory turned Huangdi into something more than a tribal leader. From that moment on, he was recognized as the great unifier, the man who had defeated chaos personified. And at the same time, his confrontation with Qi Yu revealed something else. The history of China would always be marked by that tension between order and disorder, between the power of reason and the wild forces that threatened to break everything apart. What is interesting is how the myth remained alive throughout the centuries. In some villages, the ritual dances in honor of Huangdi and Qi Yu were mixed, as if the people did not want to forget that both represented necessary poles of existence. Because without chaos, there would be no need for order. And without a formidable enemy, Huangdi would not have reached his greatness. Let us imagine the impact that this story had on those who heard it in antiquity. It was not only a tale of heroes and monsters, but a metaphor of life itself, the constant struggle against confusion, darkness and violence that threatened to devour everything. Each time the chroniclers repeated the name of Zhuolu, the listeners knew that it was not only about a past battle but about an eternal challenge. And yet victory did not bring immediate peace. Defeating Qi Yu was only the beginning. For although the Titan had fallen, new tribes, new kingdoms, and new threats awaited their turn to challenge the Yellow Emperor. The question was inevitable. Would Huangdi be able to maintain that order, that had cost him so much effort to achieve. Chapter 7. The Echo of Inventions. After the victory against Qi Yu, Huangdi was remembered not only as an invincible warrior, but as a visionary who understood that true greatness did not reside solely in conquering, but in transforming the daily life of his people. While the echoes of battle still resounded in the stories of the elders, the Yellow Emperor turned his attention to what, in many ways, would be a more lasting legacy than the sword: creation. The stories tell that during his days of reign, tools were invented that forever changed the course of civilization. One of the most famous was the primitive compass, that chariot that always pointed south, born of the need to never again get lost in Qi Yu's fog. It was not only a military artifact, it soon became a symbol of dominion over space and of the power to guide not only soldiers, but an entire people toward a more certain future. But Huangdi did not stop there. In his court flourished figures whose creativity seemed inexhaustible. It is said that Kangji, his historian, observing the tracks of birds on the sand, devised the first characters that would give rise to Chinese writing. At first they were few strokes, simple signs to record tributes and victories, but with them a new world opened. For the first time, memories no longer depended on the voice and could remain inscribed in symbols that passed through generations. It was like domesticating time. Other inventions attributed to his era include the bow and the crossbow, which expanded military power, and the construction of boats and vehicles that made it possible to expand trade routes. Even medicine took a transcendental leap. Huangdi is credited with the Yellow Emperor's Inner Classic, a treatise where the foundations of traditional Chinese medicine were established. It does not matter that modern scholars doubt his direct authorship. What is fundamental is that the myth turned this emperor into the father of a knowledge that even today is still alive in practices such as acupuncture and herbal medicine. What is fascinating is how each of these advances is wrapped in tales that border on the magical. Writing, for example, was not only seen as a practical system but as a divine gift that allowed men to speak with the spirits. And medicine was not understood as a cold science but as a bridge between the body, nature, and the cosmos. Huangdi, with his aura of demigod, appeared as the perfect mediator to bring these revelations into the human world. However, every invention carries a price. The inventions that served for peace could be used for war, and what seemed to unite the tribes could also awaken new rivalries. The compass chariot, which had saved men at Zhuolu, became such a coveted symbol of power that other peoples tried to replicate it. And writing, which was meant to preserve memory, also became an instrument to legitimize authorities and erase the vanquished. It was as if each advance, instead of closing conflicts, opened more complex paths. In this way, the reign of Huangdi took on a disquieting tone. The more civilization he managed to establish, the more challenges arose. Each step toward progress illuminated new shadows, and while his people celebrated, the ancestors seemed to murmur from the wind that no invention, however grand, could protect them from destiny. The Yellow Emperor knew it. In his gaze there was as much pride as concern, as if he understood that each victory was merely the prelude to a new challenge. Because if writing allowed history to be told, it also allowed it to be questioned. If the compass guided forward, it could also guide toward unknown and dangerous territories. And if medicine healed, it also defied death, an enemy that never allows itself to be defeated completely. The echo of his inventions spread throughout the known world, carrying with it both hope and uncertainty. And in that precarious balance, Huangdi prepared to face the dilemma deeper than any battle. Could a man, even if considered a son of heaven, keep under control the forces he himself had unleashed? Chapter 8. The Art of Exchange. While military feats and technical innovations gave prestige to the reign of Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor understood that true power was not sustained only by the sword or by ingenuity. An empire that aspired to endure had to learn to coexist with itself, to weave networks of trust among different clans. It was then that what some consider the first form of trade arose: the art of exchange. It is said that Huangdi summoned chiefs and representatives of distant villages, not to speak of war, but to agree on how to share the fruits of the earth. Their furs were traded for grain, salt for tools, horses for textiles. Money did not yet exist, but there was an invisible rule. Each object had a value that depended on the need of the other. In those gatherings, the emperor observed how a simple exchange could diffuse conflicts that previously would have ended in blood. The stories affirm that it was also in that time that rules of hospitality were established. No traveler was to be rejected if he carried something worthy of offering. No clan was to deny refuge if there was an agreement of reciprocity. With these pacts were born primitive routes that united villages and mountains, opening paths where before there had only been isolation. However, the wise men warned the emperor of a risk desire. Where there was exchange, envy also arose, greed for what belonged to others, and fear of being deceived. Huangdi, aware of this threat, decreed that every trade must be carried out in the presence of witnesses. Thus were born the first market ceremonies, where every gesture was laden with solemnity, as if heaven itself were watching over the agreement. The legends tell that, upon seeing these pacts, the spirits of the ancestors wept, not out of sadness but because they understood that men had discovered a new power. They no longer depended only on strength or lineage, but on mutual trust. It was a world where a pledged word was worth as much as a spear. Huangdi then meditated on the fragility of this balance. Trade brought abundance, but it could also awaken hidden ambitions. Whoever dominated exchange not only accumulated goods, but also influence over the other clans. The emperor knew it. Each barter was a seed that could sprout into prosperity or into discord. The art of exchange became one of the most silent legacies of his reign. It left no visible marks like battles or inventions, but it transformed the way men related to one another. And in the echo of those first markets could be heard a question that still resounded under the starry sky. Could humanity learn to share without being consumed by desire? Chapter 9. The Challenge of Immortality. As the years went by, the figure of Huangdi was transformed. He was no longer only the warrior who had defeated Qiyu, nor the sage who listened to the brightest counselors. Now in the stories that spread through villages and palaces, there was talk of an emperor who sought something even more ambitious, to defeat time itself. Death, that limit that no sword nor invention had been able to overthrow, became his new enemy. The chroniclers tell that Huangdi began to take more and more interest in the mysteries of longevity. In his court circulated alchemists who mixed minerals and plants with the hope of finding an elixir capable of prolonging life. Jade, a symbol of purity and eternity, was considered key in these formulas. Gold and cinnabar were also experimented with, substances thought to contain the essence of the immortal. But with each attempt, the risk was evident. What could give life could also bring poison. At the same time, the idea arose that immortality was not in potions, but in harmony with the universe. It was then that the first dialogues on the Tao, that invisible path that unites all things, are attributed to Huangdi. It was said that the emperor practiced deep breathing, physical exercises that imitated animals, and prolonged meditations under the night sky. These accounts, which would later influence Taoism, depicted a man who no longer only wanted to govern the earth, but to integrate himself with the cosmos. What is fascinating is how these attempts went beyond personal survival. Deep down, Huangdi sought that his people would never fall into oblivion, that the order he had established would endure beyond his flesh. Immortality was not only a selfish desire, but a metaphor for the human longing to remain. If writing ensured memory and inventions changed life, eternity promised that none of that would ever be lost. However, the stories also tell us that this quest brought with it tensions. Some of his sages supported him, convinced that in the Tao lay the supreme truth. Others looked at him with concern, fearing that by trying to break the natural order of life and death, the emperor would awaken the wrath of the gods. Even in the villages, rumors spread that certain storms and eclipses were warning signs. The story of his final ascent to heaven intertwines with these anxieties. It is said that at the end of his days, Huangdi did not die like a common man. Instead, a dragon descended from the heavens and carried him away amid lightning and clouds, while his people watched in awe and fear. Some say it was his reward for having guided humanity toward civilization. Others believe it was a punishment, a way of removing him from the world before he went too far in his challenge against death. What is certain is that his figure dissolved into mystery. No one saw his tomb, no one wept over a body. In its place remained the sense that Huangdi still dwelled somewhere in the firmament, watching, perhaps waiting, perhaps still searching for the formula that would give him eternal life. And in that uncertainty, the curtain opens to the final question, the one that would mark not only the destiny of the Yellow Emperor, but of all the tradition that remembers him. What does it truly mean to be immortal? Chapter 10. The Legacy of the Yellow Emperor. The dragon vanished among the clouds, and with it faded the figure of the Yellow Emperor, leaving his people in a silence that was both pain and reverence. Some believed that he had ascended to heaven to become immortal. Others, that he had simply crossed into the realm of the ancestors, where the great founders rest. The truth is that Huangdi did not need a body to remain. His legacy had been embedded in every corner of the collective memory, so deeply that, thousands of years later, we still pronounce his name with an echo of awe. He was not only the warrior who defeated Qi Yu, nor the inventor who gave men the compass, writing, and medicine. He was the sum of all those images, woven into a tale that each generation adapted to its own time. For peasants, he was the protector of the harvests. For doctors, the master of the balance between body and spirit. For soldiers, the invincible strategist. For sages, the bridge between men and the heavens. In every corner of China, Huangdi took on a different face, as if he were a mirror reflecting the dreams and fears of each era. The power of this myth does not lie in its historical accuracy, but in its capacity to give meaning. When dynasties fought for legitimacy, they proclaimed themselves his descendants. When people sought unity in times of fracture, they evoked his victory at Zhuolu as an example of order over chaos. And when thinkers inquired into the origin of Chinese culture, they pointed to Huangdi as the point where it all began. He was not a simple figure of the past. He was, and still is, the symbolic root of a civilization. But his story also leaves us with open questions. What does it mean to be remembered eternally? Is immortality defeating death or leaving a legacy that transcends generations? Is it a man who rises on a dragon, or is it an entire civilization that propels him to the sky? Perhaps the answer lies in the way that, even today, millions of people venerate him in temples, celebrate him in festivals, and evoke him as a common ancestor. For Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, did not disappear into the clouds. He remains present in the very identity of China. Thus, every time someone lights incense in his honor, every time a doctor applies a principle of traditional medicine, or a calligrapher traces characters that were born in his time, Huangdi is reborn. Perhaps that is his true immortality, not to defy death with potions or spells, but to perpetuate himself in culture, in memory, and in the hearts of the peoples who remember him. And perhaps that is also the greatest mystery of history. That men die, kingdoms fall, battles are forgotten, but there are figures who transcend as eternal beacons. Huangdi was one of them. His roar, his wisdom, and his ambition still resound like an echo that invites us to look back and not to remain in the past, but to understand where we come from and where we are going. Because in the end, speaking of the Yellow Emperor is not only remembering a mythical leader, it is remembering the birth of a civilization. And as long as China continues telling its story, Huangdi will continue riding that dragon of clouds, watching from above, eternal as the very idea of humanity.